Hello and welcome. You're watching Revolution EV podcast, and with me today is a seasoned leader of the battery world. It's Mr. Andreas Schneider. It's my pleasure to have you here, Andreas.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. So, before we delve into an extensive journey which you hold in this field, I would like to know something about the prominent contributions that you bring to the table and how did you step into this realm?
Yeah, I have a long-term background in the automotive industry, right? I started mostly in a consulting context in Germany, working for some of the major manufacturers here in Germany. Then later
Okay.
on, at a point where EVs were not yet super popular, I started doing a PhD thesis on electric vehicles together with Mercedes
Oh,
Corporate
wow.
Strategy. At the time, no one was interested in the topic, to be very honest. Now, obviously, this has changed a lot. I have been working more closely later on in a battery context as well. I was
Okay.
also working more recently for ABB E-Mobility, like on a corporate
Uh,
startup, developing software for electrified fleets. And then very, very recently, I have been leading one of the major battery passport projects in Europe, specifically in Germany.
yes.
And I'd like to share
Yes.
some of the insights from our project here in the
Yeah, sure, sure. I'll come to that. I'll come to that. So, as you said that you have worked a lot with the battery field, so for something who's very new to this field, tell us something about what battery passports actually mean and why is it so important globally these days?
So, first of all, a battery passport, and I'm trying to keep things simple, right? A battery passport is a digital representation of a real battery. So it's like a digital twin with a lot of
Okay.
data and a lot of insights that can be gained from that. And it's gaining, of course, a lot of importance, especially in Europe for now, because it's a new regulatory requirement for all batteries in Europe from next year,
All right.
actually already. Because the battery regulation, I'm keep it going a bit to give you some context here. I think it's really important. Not everybody knows the concept,
Yes,
for sure.
yes.
So the EU battery regulation will mandate that every battery being sold into the European market from next year, February 2027, will need to have a battery passport. And in scope are most batteries, like batteries for electric vehicles, batteries for LMT, that means like light means of transportation, for example, EV scooters, kick scooters, e-bikes, and so on and so forth, and industrial batteries with a capacity of more than 2 kWh. The whole concept as it is set up, of course, will be relevant to pretty much every player in the battery ecosystem and some EV players as well, because the main responsibility for the battery passport lies with the so-called economic operator. So that's the one selling a battery into the European market. And he will need to
Yes.
collect data from the value chain and its own operations and then process the information, right? And even other players here, like suppliers, are also affected because they will also need to gather data and then provide it to the economic operators. We also have technology providers. They develop software solutions for in this context. And even on the consumer side, if you think of people running a fleet, they will use the battery passport to make informed purchasing decisions and servicing decisions for their fleets. So it's a big topic. It's complex because a passport can contain up to
Yeah.
90 data points. Just last sentence
Yes.
here, right? These data points are in the fields of carbon footprint, supply chain due diligence, and also performance metrics, such as capacity, expected lifetime, and so on and so forth. So it's really like quite a huge and complex concept.
Okay, all right. So, as you just mentioned about the EU battery regulation, do you think that it is going to influence the adoption of the battery passports today? And because of many challenges we are facing in implementation of the battery passports globally?
Yeah, I think since it's a requirement, also and it's about compliance, at least in Europe for now, and probably other regions, and we can discuss that later on will follow, right? I think it's definitely something that will be there and that will need to be implemented latest from next year if there's no more delays. And I think for most companies in this battery ecosystem, then it's not, of course, only about being compliant, which is of course required, but the most important thing for them will be how can they get the most out of this requirement and get the most value, right? And
Exactly.
that's why
Yeah,
when we talk
exactly.
about battery passports, we very often talk about the benefits and the value a passport has for each company in each value step of the chain.
That's very true. Now that we are talking about the battery passports, can you please tell us something about its transparency across the entire supply chain? How relevant do you find the transparency today?
Yeah. So as you correctly mentioned, it's the entire value chain, right? So you really need to consider the value chain holistically. So we start with mining and refining, of course, in the beginning of the battery production process. We go to the
All right.
pre-materials, which is like cathode material, then the cells and modules manufacturing, and then we come to the pack assembly and the integration. And this is where the battery passport is being issued by the economic operator. So this is where everything starts. And then we continue
Okay.
with all the value chain with the usage later on, right? The reuse, remanufacturing, collection, and finally recycling. And what can be done, and what we also did in the project, is for each of these steps, you can define use cases, how it is the passport is being used. So, for example, reliable communication of sustainability or ESG data, right? That's very important. So the data
Yes.
can pass through the whole value chain. Another one I already mentioned in terms of the fleets or regarding the fleets, making informed purchasing decisions for the one buying, for the purchaser or the consumer. And then
Yeah.
even at the very end, and that's also very important, for example, recycling, it also helps to make recycling more efficient. And so there's a lot of
All
use
right.
cases at the different steps so that the whole ecosystem in the end can benefit.
Yes, but now that we are talking about the relevance of transparency, don't you think that mentioning about the terms like ethical sourcing and carbon tracking and ESG goals is also very important? Can you throw some light about them?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I've already mentioned some of these topics now, right?
Yes.
Um, um, so everything that you just mentioned is enabled by the battery passport. For example, the carbon footprint tracking,
Okay.
right? For now, it's super hard to gather the information from the beginning of the value chain because sometimes it's a bit unclear which material supplier from which mines is the material coming, and then what is the exact run a battery is taking in the production process. But that later on will, of course, not be the case anymore with the digital battery passport. And then you can exactly do what you just mentioned. Also, the ethical sourcing part, right? The battery passport and the softwares you're using will track where exactly the raw materials come from, which mines, and then of course the suppliers. And there will be certain, green lighting of suppliers, and you will make sure that these suppliers will need to adhere to the standards given also in EU, for example.
All right, all right. So, Mr. Andreas, you just mentioned about the battery reuse. Can you please tell me about how battery passports, exactly enable, how we can exactly enable their reuse and second life applications?
Yeah, very good. So as I mentioned just before, right, there's these use cases, and they are not only there in a, let's say, like qualitative way, but some of them have also been quantified. So you can really make it very concrete. So what can be the benefits? For example, what you just mentioned in end of life collection. So one of the
Yes.
use cases that have been also quantified was testing costs. So when it comes to the residual value determination of a battery at a certain point, the residual value cost and the testing cost can be reduced by 2 to 10%. That's one thing. For end of life collection, what you just mentioned, we found
Yes.
out that the active material demand for European passenger vehicles will be reduced by 5 to 20% because the battery passport is used at end of life for deregistration and then for
Okay.
export. And so you have a lot of data at the end of life of a battery, of the car and the battery, which then, of course, helps to know exactly what to do with the battery, with the car, and to reduce the material being used.
Yeah, exactly. So, keeping the theoretical research aside, if we talk about its practical implementation in the companies, how do you think that they should start implementing battery passports?
So generally, in the end, the battery passport is a software, right? You will collect and store and analyze and process the data in a software.
Okay.
But to get started on this, each company needs to ask themselves a couple of questions or what they want to do. As I said before, of course, you can now say, okay, we still have 1 year to go. Is it already needed to act, or can we still wait, right? Of course, you have a certain cost of inaction because you will, in the end, even lose market access in Europe if you wait too long now, right? But of course, if you do something now, you might have some costs that are redundant, or you have a supplier and supplier data that is not yet perfect. So there's like like it's like a trade-off. Also, what I mentioned before is you will need to ask yourself, if you're a company, do we just want the mere compliance? So that would be a very basic version of the software. Or do we want real business value, as I mentioned before, where we can improve our sourcing and we have all the transparency, all these benefits that I mentioned before. So there's minimal solutions and there's let's say, best-in-class solutions, right? And then, of course, the most classic questions of all in the end is make or buy, right? Of course, there are, as I mentioned, there are solution providers in the field that already offer, let's say, standard solutions. And now you can say, okay,
yes,
if we're a big company, we have a lot of financial resources, perhaps it makes sense to build our own customized in-house solutions. That might make sense for large corporations.
Exactly.
For SME, smalls, they don't do that. It's too costly, it's too expensive, so they will just buy a standard solution in the market. But this is all these, let's say, questions, and this is the spectrum where we are at, and most companies will need to start with those questions.
All right. So now that you have given us a huge, extensive insights about the battery passports, but I would like to ask, looking 5 to 10 years ahead, who do you think stands to benefit from the application of battery passports?
Yeah, I think that's a really a question, kind of who's the winner in the game, right? And
yes,
I really, and I know this is an interesting question, and I always like to say, in the end, generally the entire ecosystem will benefit from this, right?
Okay.
And the entire value chain will have additional benefits. Of course, as I mentioned, there are these software solution providers. They have new business, right? So they will make additional business because they have more. They will have clients for their software in the future. So they are definitely on the winner side,
Very
in my
true.
opinion. If we
Yes.
talk about, if you take the example I mentioned before, or when we talk about a battery recycler, and also battery recycling is something that a use case that has been quantified, so the cost can be reduced. For this use case, it's not 100% clear who gets these cost reduction or these increased profits, right? Will it be the recycler who can probably reduce the cost when they can reduce their operational recycling costs? Or will the customer then ask for lower prices and they have to split the profit or even give the profit to the customer? So I think the game has not yet been decided. Generally, it's beneficial for the ecosystem, but the specific winners, of course, it's, in my opinion, too early to call.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mr. Andreas, for sharing such insights. It's been a really engaging and an insightful conversation. Thank you for giving some time to Revolution EV, and we look forward to hear from you sometime again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.